But because Titus is zealous or fanatical in his willingness to sacrifice, it we shouldn't misinterpret that as meaning that he is somehow evil. He certainly isn't. In fact, our sympathies eventually lean toward Titus, even though he is this harsh military man who sacrifices his own kids. Again, he's not a likable tragic hero, but he is more likable than his opponents, Tamara and Aaron, and certainly Saturninus, or certainly Chiron and Demetrius. He is, as Shakespeare will later have another character say, King Lear, he is more sinned against than sinning, so an audience eventually sympathizes with him, even though if you met a guy like Titus in real life, you probably wouldn't like him. We do, however, admire or sympathize with his consistency, right? His willingness to do what he says. At the very beginning of the play, again, when Tamara says, "What would you do if this was your son? Wouldn't you be sympathetic? Wouldn't you spare him mercy?" and then Titus goes ahead and sacrifices Alarvis, but then immediately Shakespeare answers that question, right? When Mucius steps in front of Titus, and Titus unhesitatingly kills him, Shakespeare is answering Tamara's question. This is what I would do if it was my son. I would kill my son too. And even though that would scare us in real life, when we watch a character like that in fiction, we find something admirable about that consistency. Shakespeare is very careful in his dramaturgy, again, in guiding our emotions, especially towards a character like Titus. After Lavinia is raped and ravished, and she's discovered by Marcus, who gives an incredibly long and strange speech. This is not a speech you would want a family member to say if you had been traumatized in some way. He's not paying the least bit of attention to her. He's just kind of weeping and moaning over this. Shakespeare shows us Titus's response, and it's actually quite moving. Go to Act 3, Scene 1. Marcus says, "Be prepared. You'll be horribly disturbed by this." And Titus says, "Will it consume me? Let me see it then." And Marcus says, "This was thy daughter," presenting to Titus the mutilated and raped Lavinia. And Titus responds, "Why, Marcus, so she is. So she is," correcting his tense. "Ay me, this object kills me," says Lucius. And Titus says, "Faint-hearted boy, arise, and look upon her. Speak, Lavinia, what accursed hand hath made thee handles in thy father's sight?" And this is remarkable, I think, because Titus here is remarkably empathetic in response to his daughter. He corrects Marcus's tense, right, in a very healthy way. If you were doing trauma therapy in a 21st century American ER, this is what you would want a family member to do. You don't want a family member to think that somehow this trauma has happened and therefore the person is completely different. That's who she was. You want to remind that person that's been traumatized that they still are that person. A good way to get at this, for example, is just to talk briefly about dissociative disorders, what's occasionally known as multiple personality disorders. Multiple personality disorder is an extreme version of dissociative disorder. A dissociative disorder is what happens to people when they're traumatized in some way physically. When they're traumatized in some horrible way, we tend to leave ourselves. We try to step outside ourselves. I don't mean to make you uncomfortable, but think of those moments when you've been in an accident or a bike fall or some kind of event and you feel, you almost feel like you're watching this happen to you. You're watching this bad thing happen to you. That's a natural response of the body. We protect our psyche by stepping outside of ourselves and watching ourselves. In extreme circumstances, however, those traumatized are not able to reconnect. They're not able to put themselves back together. Okay, and that's why dissociative disorders, you often find, for example, young girls do a lot of cutting. They're trying to hurt their body to remind themselves that they're there. They don't feel there anymore. Their psyche feels disconnected from their very body because of that traumatic split that happened during whatever event there was. Okay, and so Titus is actually doing the right thing here by modern therapeutic terms. He's saying, "You're still here. You're still my daughter." And telling his son Lucius, "Don't look at her horrified. That's your sister. That's your sister. She hasn't changed. She hasn't gone away. She hasn't been radically transformed. She's been hurt. She's simply been hurt. That's still her, and you need to recognize her as her." So this is kind of stunning, and I'm spending a lot of time on it because I want you to see how carefully Shakespeare manages an audience's response, even to a character like Titus, who on the one hand is so fanatically zealous that he's willing to have his own hand chopped off to save his son. Aaron's able to trick him that. But he's so, in many ways, a modern loving father who is empathetic enough with his damaged daughter and strong enough to help his daughter in a very awful, terrible moment.